it's a battle.
Yeah.
Yeah, nothing.
Okay, so we are live streaming this. There are maybe about 5 people on YouTube who may be watching us, but I'm going to now say okay and got it.
Yeah, I did a live stream in China 2 weeks ago, and then they told me after there are 10,000 people watching throughout the day.
Hello, everyone who's joined us on live stream. We're live streaming this. There are maybe about 5 people on YouTube who may be watching us. Why is this on a? Why is this on a complete? Oh my God, what's going on? There's a massive delay. All the people who are joining online, please turn your videos on. If someone is coming to give us a lecture, they want to see whom they are talking to, not black boxes. It's okay to turn your video off when James is presenting his slides, but Stephanie and Natalia, thank you. Because I've recently given a couple of talks, and I was giving a talk, and it was a 3-hour session, and I was literally just talking to a sea of black boxes.
Oh, it's horrible.
And it was just like,
no. I mean, we got used to it during COVID.
It was like, what if I turn my video off now?
No, I know what you mean. We demand.
Yeah, it's really, yeah, it's effort. How's it looking, Nico? Can't hear you.
The actual YouTube stream was open in a different tab. Elizabeth had opened it, and that's why we had the original happening
and then
stream at the same. And I think it's fine now. I hope.
Yeah. Shall we kick off then? Is everybody there? Okay, great. So most of the class is in the class, James, which is really lovely. Hello, everyone. Please come in front. Tim, Angie. There are empty seats. Please do come in front. Hi, hello. And there are some students who are joining online, but we're going to start. Should I say something? Yes? Okay. I'm really delighted to welcome James Auger to our class today. James was a tutor at the Royal College of Art when I was graduating from interaction design that then became design interactions. So James has been working with ideas of critical design and speculative design for a really long time. James, basically, on graduating from design products at the Royal College of Art, moved to Dublin to conduct research at Media Lab in Europe, exploring the theme of human communication as mediated by technology. After MLE, he worked in Tokyo as guest designer at the Issey Miyake Design Studio, developing new concepts for mobile phones. Between 2005 and 2015, James was part of the critically acclaimed Design Interactions Department at the Royal College of Art and continued his development of critical and speculative approaches to design and technology, completing his PhD on the subject in 2012. And last time I was giving you a lecture, I showed you a screenshot of James's PhD thesis and his definition of speculative design. So you're all slightly familiar with James's work. Currently, James is director of the design department at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, and he is doing a lot of new innovative work around design curriculum, design education. But most importantly, he's also I would say, pioneer of the idea of reconstrained design. And he's put that into practice through the work of gravity batteries and related products and objects that he co-designed with the team in the Orkney Islands. And so we're really excited to have you here, James, because this semester we are exploring the idea of energy independence, and we're exploring how to design new and different ways of reimagining energy, especially for us in Austria. We are very close to Ukraine, and we are really feeling the energy crisis very strongly. So thank you, and over to you.
Oh, thanks, Anab, and thank you for the invitation. So I'll talk a bit about reconstrained design today. I'll probably finish with the energy project and the work. We did a little bit in Orkney, but it was mostly undertaken in Madeira, the Portuguese island in the middle of the Atlantic. So I mean, you talked a little bit about the background there. We shifted consciously away from speculative design as a description. Probably, for me, it was around 2015. I got slightly tired of that term because it started to mean other things and didn't really represent the kind of work that I was hoping to do. So moving to Madeira was an opportunity to really reflect upon the 10 years at the Royal College of Art as a teacher. Think about the key strengths of speculative design, but somehow move beyond. So that's really the premise of this talk, is that period of reflection in Madeira and the coining of the term reconstrained design, but also essentially the philosophy behind it. So I shall try and share a screen. I'm not seeing, just give me 2 seconds. We should have checked this beforehand, shouldn't we?
Nico, would you need to enable sharing? Or?
No, I've got it now. There was just my keynote was hidden in the background. Is you seeing that okay?
Yes.
So,
perfect.
Okay, so you've got the reconstrained design there as the title of the talk. There's the school where I'm based, École Normale Supérieure Paris-Saclay. So this is probably something quite familiar to yourself, Anna. Sorry, I just need to kill my 1 second again, sorry. I've got my window with everybody's face in it covering my screen. There we go. So really what happened was there was this questioning of speculative design, and really, I guess, a kind of speculative design fatigue, where we'd been developing projects, both myself and contemporaries and the students that were coming out of the design interactions department, but there was this rising critique of the work simply going to die in the gallery space, and an increasing demand for, I suppose, for us to be a little bit more active, to be participating more in the real world. And so it drew me back to really what was the starting point of speculative design. And for me, it's very much based in this quote by Ursula K. Le Guin. So she's talking here about imaginative fiction. This is from an interview that she gave, I think, probably about 10, 15 years ago. And here she's saying that imaginative fiction trains people to be aware that there are other ways to do things and other ways to be, and that there is not just one civilization, and it is good, and it is the way we have to be. So that in many ways describes speculative design as a way of challenging, let's say, mainstream design, normative design, where designers are only working for the marketplace to sell more products, under the illusion that this is good, that design creates a preferable or a better world. So through speculative design, we can imagine alternative ways to be. That was really the starting point. And when we put that into practice, what it really comes down to are constraints. So constraints being, let's say, something super familiar to the designer. I remember really going back to my Bachelor of Art in Product Design, long time ago, but really constraints being one of the first things that we talked about. So I started delving a little bit deeper into this idea of constraints, and found myself at this this quote from, well, it was during the interview that Charles Eames gave in I think it was 1972, the Eames Q&A, you'll find it on their website. He's being interviewed by Madame El Amich, and she says, does the creation of design admit constraint? And Charles Eames says, design depends largely on constraints. And she says, what constraints? And he responds, the sum of all constraints. Here is one of the few effective keys to the design problem. The ability of the designer to recognize as many of the constraints as possible. Her willingness and enthusiasm for working within these constraints. And these are constraints of price, of size, of strength, of balance, of surface, of time, and so forth. Each problem has its own peculiar list. So why I find this interesting is that whilst I agree with Eames that it's one of the key, one of the few effective keys to the design problem is to recognize as many of the constraints as possible. I totally agree with that. But when we look at the constraints that Eames is listing, they're all existing on the scale of the object. So you might have the pliability, the bendability of this wood, how far we can mold it until it breaks, how it can support the weight of a person, its price, how much can you sell it for at a profit, of time, how long does it take to mold, to bring it to market, etc., etc. They're all very, very simple, obvious constraints. But when we started really looking deeper into the subject, and this is what speculative design was good for essentially, was that by stepping away from the market as a constraint, you're free to develop a very different version of design with different value systems, different philosophies, approaches to technology, etc., etc. They're called these open constraints. Constraints that are somewhat hidden, or they're so ubiquitous we just take them for granted. We just work within the system because it's so normalized. Sorry, you've got the mic open.
Florian, can you turn your mic off? Or maybe Elizabeth can mute him. Sorry.
That's better.
Thank you.
Thank
Sorry.
you. It was getting a bit noisy there.
Yeah.
So that was really the starting point for this. So at the beginning of 2015, I started writing a blog with my colleague Julian Hanna. I'll give you the link at the end, but it's called Crap Futures. And it was really the evolution of this idea of reconstrained design. So I'll jump now into the key part of the talk, which are, well, it's a list of the constraints that we came across. There are more of them. So this is a kind of reduced version of the list within this talk. But for each constraint, I'll give a brief description of how it acts upon the act of designing. And then I'll respond with a version of reconstrained design. So how design can be practiced differently outside of the constraints that are essentially becoming problematic. So the first one is progress dogma. It really works very well with this quote from Langdon Winner, who's talking about it's essentially our faith in technology, that it's ongoing, this faith. It really goes back to the modernist project, the beginning of the 20th century, even way beyond that. But it becomes really affirmed, it becomes made concrete during the 20th century. And I like this last little word here, that there's a link between technical development and human well-being, and that it affirms that the next wave of innovations will surely be our salvation. It's that we believe that technology will lead to a preferable and a better future. So there's this image here from Jordan Mott. It was commissioned by Jordan Mott. It was, you can probably read that, painted by Christian Schussler. Sorry, I've got a bar covering the titles at the bottom. And it was commissioned to celebrate the inventors who were seen to have positively altered the course of human civilization, positively, to have created a positive change in the United States during the 19th century. So what we have in this image, you have Cyrus McCormick, who invented the mechanical reaper, Charles Goodyear, who invented vulcanized rubber, Elias Howe, who invented the sewing machine, William T.G. Morton, who invented surgical anesthetic. So whilst it wouldn't be difficult to argue that these are all very positive innovations or inventions, some of them are a little bit more ambivalent. The gentleman there, fourth from the left, is Samuel Colt. And some of you know his invention. It's the revolving gun, seen here as being I guess, positive in the colonization of the United States, the domination of the frontiers, etc., the wiping out of the people who were living there previously. So this was seen as a positive invention. And it talks very much about the complexities of technology and how they change futures and how they give control to certain groups of people. So we're going to jump forward here. The next image, although the media is different, it's a very, very similar portrayal. Here, this is Trump's inaugural meeting of the technologists from 2016. You see there, two away from Trump is Tim Cook from Apple, Peter Thiel sitting to Trump's left, a very, very complicated, dangerous character in my mind, got his money from PayPal, but a serious, complicated neoliberal type. We have Jeff Bezos, and we know what he's done with Amazon. I think Elon Musk is there somewhere, I think really hidden there on the right-hand side. So what we have here, if we go back and forth, is essentially the same group of people. I mean, there are a couple of women in the room there, but one of them's Trump's daughter, so I don't think she really counts. It's the same group of people who are dictating and deciding all of our futures through their lobbying power, through their financial power, through their ability to buy out certain companies and evolve the technologies that are at the core of those companies. It's something as a paper really worth reading here, Richard Barbrook's California Ideology, where he talks about the rise of Silicon Valley from the hippies and the computer culture of the 1960s to the mega corporations that live there today. And you have this the kind of combining of these kind of radical individualism, libertarianism, neoliberal economics, and techno-utopianism. So this is progress dogma, and you can see it really running rife with the likes of Peter Thiel and the whole Silicon Valley culture. Technology is great, and technology is going to improve all of our lives. Coming back to design, there's a long history of design's participation in this. This is an image from the 1939 World's Fair in New York, designed by Norman Bel Geddes, an ex-set designer, funded by General Motors Corporation. It was called Futurama, and it depicted a vision of the United States set some 25 years in the future. So this was set in a period before the motorway, before you had these superhighways connecting the cities. And this was a vision of those superhighways. And of course, the main product from General Motors is the motor car. And the better the roads, the faster the roads, the more need there is for fast cars. And all of this was being supported by the federal government because the road building plan was high up on their agenda. So here you have the designer working to sell a particular future, seeing this as a very utopian future. There's a great video that goes with this called New Horizons. You'll find that online if you Google New Horizons, General Motors, and you'll see the whole of this kind of ideology of progress dogma, portraying and depicting these very techno-utopian futures. So this is the motor car, the future of the motor car viewed from 1939. And then, of course, the future was no utopia. This is an image from somewhere in China in 2010. It was the biggest traffic jam in human history. I think it was something like 3 days of queuing to get through this this traffic jam. The point being that when we depict visions of the future, we have to acknowledge that things will also go wrong. There will be implications, not just applications. And we think it's the designer's responsibility to also be exploring and examining and questioning our futures, rather than just putting new things in the world and expecting everything to go well. We need to be responsible for what could also go not so well. For the motor car, for example, of course, there's the traffic jam, but there was climate change, there's the car crash, there's insurance fraud, there's a whole range of super complicated implications that make human lives more miserable. Certainly not utopian. So the reconstrained design here is quite straightforward. It's that when we imagine potential futures, this was a very, very early project. As Anab said, we've been doing this for some time with my long-term collaborator, Jimmy Loiseau, really our first speculative design project from 2001, was looking at near future telecommunication. What we did at the time was to propose a telephone that would be implanted into the tooth during routine dental surgery. It was somehow a combination of the miniaturization of the telephone that was happening at the time. So the rise of mobile phones, of portability, of always being available. We imagine that combining with the notion of the cyborg, that the telephone becomes a part of the body. So we proposed this in 2001. It was exhibited at my master degree show at the RCA. It was picked up quite quickly by the Science Museum in London, who chose it for one of their, I can't remember what the exhibition was called. It was a near future exhibition. What happened then was quite crazy. Their press officer started talking about this idea, and probably within 2 days, we went from being RCA design students to technologists who were envisaging our telephonic futures. So it went quite viral. And we really saw this as the first opportunity to go outside of the gallery, to see the media as a gallery space, as a place for disseminating ideas and possible futures. And of course, the point being is that we're putting possible futures into the world before they happen. So we're not selling this, we're not making it happen, we're not developing the technology, it's purely conceptual. But it's in the public domain and people start talking about it. Here we are on the front cover of Time magazine. This is a genuine scan of Time magazine from 2003, and they're listing the coolest inventions of 2002. That's not Photoshop, but it doesn't really get to the point. I mean, the point here is it's disseminating quite broadly. The point is the letters that started to arrive. This is from an associate professor of medicine at Stanford, and this was a 3-page letter that he sent in the post. It starts with, as a physician, I believe the technology you describe in your press release has the potential for producing immense social harm. And this social harm would include psychological trauma and angry behavior in both the workplace and the home. This is fantastic for us. This is really the key product here, because what we're doing is analyzing and examining and testing a technological product before it arrives. Therefore, we can start to discover the implications and bring in legislation to stop it happening, or redesign the object to avoid the problematic aspects. This still is not happening, as we can see today, the damage being done by social media on a whole group of young people. Essentially, it's a massive pool of experimentation, testing the psychological well-being of the most vulnerable people in our society, teenagers, I would say. I'm speaking from experience because I have a 14-year-old daughter who I'm fighting with day in, day out to get her off TikTok and various things, and it's a terrible addiction. There was no way of testing that. That just arrived in the world, and we're all suffering from it. Legislation will become later, but by then it's too late. So that's the first one, the constraint of progress dogma, and the reconstraining being that we can design to imagine and explore the problematic aspects of possible futures. The next one is more pragmatic. We call this one future nudge. As another quote here, this time from Robert Harbrauner. He was an economist in the United States, and he's looking at the way technology evolves very much in an evolutionary way, almost like a natural organism. And the last line again, if nature makes no sudden leaps, neither it would appear does technology. So we can see with nearly every single product a lineage that goes back through time, with new developments in technology leading to an iteration of the model. So new technologies arrive and something advances the object beyond its previous version. So there's a lineage going back that we can, in many cases, going back hundreds of years. What this does, it essentially constrains the designer to designing only what this existing lineage could evolve into. So it really narrows the potential of what can be designed. For example, if we're looking at the next iteration of the motor car, it's potentially electric. So we're shifting away from the internal combustion engine and proposing electric vehicles. This, in my mind, is just it's an economic paradigm shift. It's not particularly beneficial for the environment, but it's an easy addition, or it's an easy iteration to imagine. It's great for the economy because we're using all of the same infrastructure. A lot of the production lines will be easy to adapt, and then we're just using an electrical engine rather than a fuel burning one. And in this case, we've got the next iteration beyond that, which is the driverless car. It's still using essentially the same infrastructure, but with an added layer of computation and sensing. It doesn't mean that this is the best way to move ourselves around. And here's another example, 7 generations of the iPhone. This obviously continues. It's a few years old, this image, but you can see this with 4 or 5 more versions of the iPhone. What this does, it really narrows the potential. What it means is that design essentially becomes instrumentalized. When we think about communicating across a distance, we'll think about the latest version of the smartphone, and the next version of that will just potentially have more features, or it'll be smaller or more powerful. So the reconstrained design here, there are different versions of doing this, and I'm currently running a brief with my Master 1 students on counterfactual histories. Counterfactuals are a great way of stepping out of these lineages to imagine different versions of today. This is a loose version of a counterfactual where we could imagine stepping outside of that lineage around the time of the telephone box, or around the time when telephones first became portable, to take a few steps back and imagine the motivation here is not about being available, it's not about being portable, it's not about being smart, it's about creating the conditions for the perfect phone call. So this is the reconstrained design here, is stepping outside of future nudge as a lineage to reimagine the event that's being designed. This is a project that Jimmy and myself did at Media Lab Europe in Dublin. And it's a telephone that combines, obviously, telephonic capabilities. You can speak to somebody somewhere else in the world, but it's combining that with the sensory deprivation tank. So we're depriving the brain from any incoming sensory information. There's no sense of touch because the water's heated to body temperature. There's no outside sound because it's acoustically padded. It's opaque, so you can't see anything. And of course, you can't interact with anybody else because you don't know whether there's anybody else there. You're just solely focusing on the voice of someone else coming in from somewhere else in the world. I'll just show a little bit of the video that we developed to describe this.
Oh,
Hello?
can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, I was just wondering if is everything cool on your end? It feels really weird to be.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's good. I'm glad that we decided to meet up.
Yeah.
It's been a long time.
So what are you getting up to these days?
Well, living with a Spanish guy now
Really? Whereabouts?
in north of Smithfield.
How long have you been there?
Like 8 months now.
The video is going on for a little while. I'll just let it play in the background for a minute. So the point here is that rather than just allowing your design solutions to be dominated by a history, by the way people have always done things traditionally, we can step outside of these lineages to really get back to the core of the problem and then find new radical solutions. And I think this is really important for designers today, because a lot of the lineages that evolved during the 20th century are now revealing themselves to be fundamentally problematic. And that might be in terms of the devices that have been created, their reliance upon different infrastructures, like whether it be telecommunications, whether it be internet systems, etc., etc. It really keeps us very much within entrenched solutions, and it's really possible to step outside of those to reimagine how things could be. Okay, I'm going to jump on quickly because there are a few more to get through. The next one we're calling unconstraints, and this was an important moment because as we were thinking about constraints, first of all, we thought about should it be unconstraints, but of course, unconstraints are just as problematic as bad constraints because it means that anything's possible. And there's a quote here, I've not got this one in text, but in 1970, the American economist Milt Friedman famously called for the freeing of business from any pretense of social responsibility on the basis it went against the interest of shareholders. He argued that companies that did adopt responsible attitudes would be faced with more binding constraints than companies that did not, rendering them less competitive. So what are these constraints? And what does it mean to have social responsibility today? So there's this image here. This part of this talk was really aimed towards the French industry. So I'm picking up a little bit on the French history of the art décoratif and objects like this. And we could argue that the unconstrained approach to designed objects can be traced back to the colonial era. Arthur Chandler had noted that at the time of the 1855 World's Fair, this was the big World's Fair in Paris, just a few years after the London version, he said the French attitude is a mixture of pure greed and a dawning sense of the civilizing mission of France. Africa will supply the raw materials, and in return, France will supply the most precious of all commodities, French civilization. And it's really this idea that it doesn't matter where the materials come from. We can really use the whole world as a supply. Here, in this case, it's the wood coming from Africa. And nothing really has changed. So if we're looking at a contemporary object, the iPhone comprises 75 of the 118 elements from the periodic table. And just for reference, the human body is made up of around 30. And there was an article in the Los Angeles Times where the writer Brian Merchant described pulverizing an iPhone and analyzing the resulting dust using mass spectrometry, X-ray fluorescence, and infrared analysis. Excuse me, he goes on to suggest that to obtain the 100 or so grams of minerals found in a single iPhone, miners around the world have to dig, dynamite, chip, and process their way through around 75 pounds of rock on nearly every continent. I think this just goes to show how little has changed in terms of the colonial attitude to materials. At the moment, rare earth elements are the newest big resource, largely coming from China. Lithium, obviously feeding a lot of the batteries now going into electric vehicles and the power walls of Tesla. Again, coming from very specific countries, and we're just stealing these from the earth and changing economies, changing the whole political powers that exist in places, just to fuel the process of design and the objects we see as being desirable. So this is the reconstraint. Rather than using the whole world as a potential source of materials, of labor, etc., we can start to explore local solutions. So Tom Lynch was a student of design interactions. This is his 2012 graduate project called the Open Source Vacuum Cleaner. Tom started out by dismantling a Dyson. I think it's a great idea to dismantle as many Dysons as possible. This is a pure example of a constrained version of design where you've got dodgy plastics being made in factories somewhere else in the world, assembled, distributed radially, and then consumed until they break, which usually happens quite quickly. So Tom took apart the Dyson and then replicated every single element with something found or made locally. So from the local hardware store, wood that was found in the local wood workshop, switches that could be found very easily. He's got there some drinks containers that he's hacked to create the vacuum chambers. And all of this then existed on a wiki. He built a wiki that described how to make it and also where each of the individual components could come from. The idea then being that people around the world would add their own local knowledge to this. So wherever you are, there would be a local list of materials and people could start to deliver and make their own objects. This all came together, I think, for around €40, and it worked pretty much as well as the Dyson. And it really starts to imagine a different version of design where there are constraints, and this is where it becomes a real problem, because it may lead to the company being less competitive than somebody who's acting in an unconstrained way. But really, we have no choice at this time. We cannot keep taking things from the planet. It's been proven that this is no longer viable. So what are the local solutions? What does it mean for how things look, who makes them, how they work? I think it raises a lot of very interesting philosophical questions about the role of design and the technological products that we design as designers and that people are consuming, repairing, using, etc., etc. So this is, for me, this is quite an influential project, and I'm seeing an increasing number of projects like this starting to emerge from the schools where we're teaching here in France. Right, the next one is slightly more philosophical. We call this means and ends, and it's largely inspired by Albert Borgmann's device paradigm. So if you want to read a decent philosophical approach that really allows you to really think about how our devices work today, I can give you some links for this at the end, but Borgmann's device paradigm essentially separates the objects we make into two categories. On the first hand, he has things, And for Borgman, things are inseparable from their context, and we engage and interact with them in their worlds. And in this case, he's got the fireplace, the hearth as a focal point in the family home. And what we have here then is the wood that's been gathered locally. It's connecting us to the outside environment. There's the storage of the wood, the knowledge of how to build the fire, and then using that as a focal point for gathering around, where the family gathers there to eat, to socialize, the cooking of the food, etc. Everything is in its context, and we are interacting with everything in that context. It gives us a control and a knowledge over the entire experience. Compared to the thing, what Borgman uses is the term device. And the device unburdens us of the context through the operation of background machinery. The more advanced the technology, the more invisible or concealed the machinery. And Borgman used the fireplace, the central heating system as an example of the device. So this is disburdening us of all these elements, and the means become invisible. This is coming back to the constraint here, the means and the ends. With the fireplace, the means and the ends are together. They combine and connect. So we need to know the means, we have control over the means, and the end there is the fire. They work very nicely together. Whereas with the device, in this case, the central heating system, the means are all hidden, controlled and managed and operated, installed, etc. by others. And all we simply need to do is to turn a knob to receive the heating. That's the only way we interact with the system. These are becoming increasingly opaque because through automation, there's no longer even a button. Things are becoming increasingly complicated, increasingly opaque, increasingly managed by complex computer systems. And then when these go wrong, we really have zero control whatsoever. There's a nice quote here from Baudrillard. I think this was written in 1968, where he's saying if something is automatic, it's hermetically sealed, it amounts to a closing off, which exiles us to the responsibility of a mere spectator. And this, for me, is the fundamental problem with devices. We're increasingly becoming spectators in our own lives. So slightly abstract project here is the reconstraint. This was a project I developed together with Phillips Research in 2008. It's on the subject of smell. So looking at the hidden sense of smell and the hidden potential of the sense of smell. So this is, in a way, I suppose, the constrained world where means and ends are totally separate. The means here are these kind of new dating websites where you input a whole bunch of information about yourself, very sensitive information, and then algorithms will enact a dating process, and you'll find a potential partner, whereas the means are all hidden. You don't know what's going on. Your perfect partner arrives as if by magic. And you'll see through apps, this is becoming increasingly the case, whether it's how we date people, how we diagnose things. It's everywhere at the moment through the rise of use of data, etc., etc. So this project is very much going against that. It's slightly provocative, this image, but it's the idea that we could potentially find a partner through smell. Now, it seems abstract because culturally, this is something that we've not done for a very, very long time. Smell was really demoted as a sense during the Renaissance period and after, where smell was seen as being somehow animalistic, and we were encouraged to cover it through perfumes, through deodorants, etc., etc. It was something for poor people and the beasts. And as a consequence, very little research was done on the sense of smell, as the scientists were focusing on the visual senses and the auditory senses of art and music, etc., the heightened senses. And it's only quite recently that scientists are starting to truly understand more about the sense of smell. For example, and this was really the starting point for this project, that scientists have discovered there's the HLA alane, which is something that exists within the crotch area and the armpits, extremely responsible for your well-being, the health of the human body in comparison to other people. So this, what I'm saying sounds very abstract, but if you were to have a baby with a partner who smelled differently to yourself, that baby would have a higher immune system than if you were to marry someone with the same smell as yourself. Now that sounds super abstract because I don't know how I smell. I don't know even how to learn how I smell. But this is completely backed up, the science, by a group of people who live in the Amazon, the Dazana. And for them, smell is the champion sense. And it's a taboo to marry somebody who smells the same as yourself. So this idea here is that, first of all, you would plug yourself into yourself and learn your own smell. And then you can compare that to somebody else and choose them as your partner based on the smells emerging from the apocrine glands. This went on to other areas as well. So again, it's really the means of the experience coming together with the end. This is health diagnosis through the sense of smell, based on research by Avicenna and Hippocrates, both of whom suggested smell could be a way of diagnosing illness. Recently, research has showed that dogs can smell cancerous cells really way before any scientific method. And here's the calibration of cooking through the same idea of matching calibrated scents there in the vials at the back to the smell emerging from the food. I'm going to whiz through this one quickly because I want to get to the end project that talks more about energy, but this is really about education as a constraint, with a focus in this case on making. There's a quote here, another one from Maslow, that says if the only tool you have is a hammer, to treat everything as if it were a nail. And that's a fundamental problem in a lot of design schools, where largely through, I would say, to progress dogma, manual machines have been replaced by 3D printers and laser cutters. And everything starts to look like this, and it's the most depressing thing on the planet for me as a product designer. So the point being that we really need more tools, and we need to know how to use more tools. So super quickly, this is a clock that I made through a Swiss commission in 2015. So we've got a 3D model on a computer that's been turned into a mold, and then boat making techniques. This is gel coat and fiberglass. That's part of the mold after it's cured. That's two pieces have come together to create this 600 millimeter sized donut. Taxidermy, one of our students at the RCA was learning taxidermy, so she created this finch for me that looks like it's jumped off a wall and it's diving towards the ground. And there's the object. So here we've got quite complicated carpentry at the back there, cabinet making, this wooden box. There's some metal machining, there's the boat making, there's the taxidermy, there's a little bit of programming with the stepper motor there. And basically the bird normally sits at 7 o'clock, and then on the hour, every hour, just one revolution, it accelerates and then flies through the window and then stops at 7, and then you have to wait for another hour for the spectacle. Right, this is where we're going to end. It's the final one. It's a big one, and I think it's relevant to all of your projects on energy. It's the constraint of infrastructure. So if we look at how energy became, let's say, the domestic model during really the early 20th century, what we have is the burning of fossil fuels, typically in the countryside. I mean, in France, that would today be probably a little bit more nuclear. We are seeing a shift towards renewables, but this is still, until recently, the dominant model. Distributed radially across countrysides through pylons and cables, arriving in our homes through these sockets in the wall. The constraint here acts in two ways. It acts on consumers, because this dictates how we use energy. If I've got an electronic or an electrical product, I simply plug it into the wall and it works as if by magic. So coming back to the device paradigm from Borgman, things are devices. All of the energy needs are dislocated. They're hidden behind the wall. We have no idea how much we're consuming. We don't know where the energy is coming from. And our only reaction is the switch on the object and the bill that maybe comes once a month. It also constrains designers, because let's say, for example, a company or an agency commissions me to design a kettle. I'll start sketching the form of the kettle. I might try some different materials. I might do some prototyping on the spout to check it pours nicely. I'll do a little bit of research into heating elements and where they come from. But then what I'll do, once all that's done, I'll simply put a cable on it and it'll have a socket like this. And that's how it'll work. I won't think of any other solution to the heating of that water. I'm going to develop the kettle and it's going to work with energy in this format. So the constraint here steps away from these dominant infrastructural models to go back to the core of the problem. I don't think, if we want a few questions, I'm going to skip this. Have a look at this afterwards if you've got time. This is a project that Jimmy and myself developed a long time ago. It's the idea that we could charge a battery from the body of a loved one who's passed away through the use of a microbial fuel cell. So this battery that you're looking at has been charged through the dead body of someone that we love. Now, the reason I'm showing this is because it creates a different relationship with the energy inside the battery. That energy has meaning because it's come from someone who's no longer with us. And because that energy has meaning, we think much more about how we use it. What kind of product are we going to put it in? When are we going to use that product and for how long, knowing that the amount of energy there is limited? And it was very much acting as an inspiration for this project in Madeira, in so much as how can we create a different relationship to the energy we use. And this is the Madeiran project. It's called the Newton machine. This is the image you get of Madeira when you fly into the island. So you see the banks of photovoltaic panels there on the hillside. You see the wind turbines scattered on the tops of the hills. You get the impression that it's a very energy renewable friendly place. What you don't see in this image is the huge bank of diesel generators there at the bottom of the hillside that are burning 24 hours a day to replace the energy when the sun goes behind a cloud or when the wind stops blowing. Also, what you don't see is the legislation enforced by the energy companies, because what happened was around 10 years ago, photovoltaics became really available for use. They become pretty functional. And people were given incentives on the island to buy solar panels. The idea being that you would use the solar energy when you're home. When you're not home, the energy is still being generated. It's not being consumed. You can sell it back to the energy grid and therefore reduce your bills. And the problem is that the people who own the energy grid make a profit from selling energy. They don't like to buy it. It challenges their business model. And this also acts as a constraint, because if they say, no, we're not going to buy it for that rate, that energy just becomes wasted. And that's really what's happened in Madeira. They reduced the price year on year on year that they buy energy for, to the point now it's something like 7 to 1, the price they buy energy compared to the price they sell energy for. And people are no longer using solar panels unless they're retired and spending most of their time at home. This is another image of Madeira. This is the Cabo Geral. It's the highest cliff face in Europe, I believe, something like 780 meters high. And you have all of these cliff face communities. And this really was the breakthrough of the project. If we're going back to the constraints, so the constraints of the energy grid, the constraints of solar panels and when energy is generated, it became clear that the key problem is storage, that there is no storage mechanism, and that the solution, a little bit like Tom Lynch's project, is situated, it's local. So what can we use in the way of local materials, local terrains, local knowledge, all of the elements that go into the design problem being somehow used to create local solutions. So this is the first image of the first prototype image of the gravity battery. This was the solution we developed. And the simple principle is that you've got a solar panel generating electricity. That electricity here is turning a DC motor, and then via a gearbox, a weight is lifted into the sky. When you need the energy, when you want to power an electrical product, let's say it's nighttime, the bottle is dropped, and as it falls, it turns the gearbox, and in reverse there, the DC motor acts as a generator, and you've got a way then of generating electricity through gravity. There's a little video here of this in use.
Hello, I'm Johnny Cash. I hear the train coming, it's rolling around the bend. At night, see the sun shines. I don't know where, I'm stuck in Folsom Prison. And time keeps dragging on. But that train keeps rolling all down the slide that I'm going. Always be a good boy, don't ever play good. I got a man.
So what we have here, again, reacting very nicely, I think, to Borgmann's device paradigm, the means and the ends really coming together The means here is a very visible system. We've got control over the system and it's very tangible. I can see exactly where the water bottle is. I can see the rate at which it's falling. I get an idea when it's going to hit the ground. When it hits the ground, my energy's run out. If I turn up the volume on my record player, the weight starts falling more quickly because I need more energy for that extra volume. And I have a very tangible relationship between the size of the falling mass, the height it is above the ground, and the type of electrical product that I'm hoping to use. What you can see there in the close-up is the gearbox. So that was built using gears that we just found in a local lathe. And we used a CNC machine to build the side plates of the gearbox. So everything was made quite simply. It wasn't that complicated in our local machine shop. That there is a cafe in our institution. It's about 12 meters high, the cafe space there. And that, with this very first iteration of the gravity battery, the weight falling was 18 kilograms. And we could play the whole side of Folsom Prism Blues using the system. What we have here then, unlike a regular record player that plugs into the wall, we have the entire system. We've got the turntable itself, but then we've got the entire system necessary to allow it to function. As I said, the first version used this homemade gearbox, but that was a bit problematic because not everyone has access to the CNC machine to make the accurate milled plates. We realized then that there are gearboxes everywhere. In this case, this is a scrap motorcycle engine. Someone had fallen off it. The local bike breaker gave us this. They donated it. And often when a motorcycle is either left for many, many years or it's been crashed, one bit that remains intact is the gearbox because it's filled with oil and it's very well protected. So these exist all over the world. And very, very quickly, you can hack the gearbox and turn it into a gravity battery. In this case, we built a wooden frame for it. And what we started to do was raise the size of the falling mass because the bigger the falling mass, the more energy is potentially stored. We also perform this at a few festivals. This is in Rotterdam, and the local bike breaker donated this on the very first day. And after about 8 hours, it looked like that. And again, we played music here. Here we played the music for the party on the opening night of the festival. And in this case, we're using the whole motorcycle engine and the frame and the rear wheel as part of the system. The string goes around the rear wheel, which acts as a pulley and then goes up over a rafter into the ceiling. And as Anna had mentioned, we took this to Orkney. We won a project at the CCCB gallery in Barcelona. And part of our proposal was to do this as a kind of scrap heap challenge project in the Scottish Orkney Islands. So this is a vision of the Scottish Orkneys. People there are already extremely aware in terms of their relationships with energy because they're on the periphery. They're not on the mainstream grid. So they've already got this very, very interesting bespoke relationship with the energy that they're generating and using. So we started out scouring the island for scrap engine parts. We found that on the second day. It'd been in a chicken shed for 10 years, absolutely useless as a motorcycle. It would never work again. But the gearbox was perfectly intact. It had been sitting in oil. We found a motor locally that had a built-in gearbox already, which allowed us to even increase further the weight that we'd need to turn it over. And in this case, we used it to play a music device, a keyboard that we'd found on the island, and the guy there in the shorts in the background played the music at the party at the end of the session. There you can see the weight falling down. And of an island, on the island, there were about 140 inhabitants, and of that 140, 25 of them participated in this workshop. And really the idea here is the portability of the concept and its ability to bring communities together. It's not like regular design or technological artifacts that are built elsewhere in the world in factories. It's about bringing communities together as one of the elements that are found locally. All right, super fast through the last bit. All of that information is on a wiki that you'll find there. Looking at the role of design, really, that I think nobody would there in the room would argue that this is not your typical designed artifact. We're used to design products being a little bit more aesthetically pleasing than that. So we did want to develop a second branch of the project which addressed the role of design. but using exactly the same principles. So this is wood found on the local hillside. There we are a few days later after it's been machined in the shop. There's my son and his friend gathering the black volcanic sand from the Madeiran beach. Here's a single mold for concrete with some phosphor bronze elements in there. That's after it's been demolded. It's concrete filled with lead shot, and there are two hemispheres here measuring 30 centimeters in diameter and weighing around 80 kilograms. It's also about who gets to make, so it's not just about DIY, but perhaps do it locally. So there's a metal workshop just down the hill from where I used to live. There's a wood workshop just down the road, and it's about engaging local makers in the system. So rather than things being made somewhere else in the world that we never hear about, the whole local system is being enacted to build the things for us. And that's the final product. It's a gravity lamp. So in the middle of the two hemispheres, you have LEDs that hit a prism and beam the light out horizontally. And what it has is around 30 minutes of fall time. So you've got to lift the weight into the sky. It can be through solar panels, it can be through a hand crank. And then that weight falls almost like an egg timer, beaming a light on the wall until it hits the ground, it goes out, and then you've got to find a way of lifting it back up again. And the final image, we also wanted to start to increase the complexity of the objects we're making through this system. So this is an example of a vinyl player, a gravity-powered vinyl player, again, using the same principles of local sand, local woodwork. And one of the projects we're proposing here in France is to do the same thing with a range of products. If we put a pin in the ground and draw a 500-kilometer radius, everything has to be sourced within that circle. But what does that do to the design process? What does it do for the objects we can make, the quality of those objects, the cost of those objects, the size of those objects, when those constraints are placed upon the product? The tumbler I mentioned earlier is there. It's on Crap Futures, so you can see the whole history and documentation of reconstrained design there. You'll see us on Crap Futures, at Crap Futures, and reconstrained.design is the full project described there through images and texts and essays, etc., etc. On that note, I shall stop the share. And the reconstrained design book, I can also share that. It exists as a PDF for a free download if anybody wants to read more about that project.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you. Please, can I request all my Zoom students to turn their videos on for the Q&A so James get a sense of whom he's been talking to. Thank you. And then there are students here. I know we are on time, but James, if you have 5 to 10 minutes, can we just have a few questions? Or
yeah, of course. Yeah. I wasn't sure how strict we were with the clock, so I was trying to accelerate a little bit to give some time there. But we started slightly. No problem at all.
We did, and we had tech issues, and also it's just really relevant because last semester we did a salvage project. So we actually visited Vienna's, Austria's iron ore pit, learned about material histories, and learned to try and build objects from only found local situated materials. So there was and then now we're doing, so I think, I feel like James's work really resonates with both the subjects, the topics we've been looking in the studio. And I did forget to mention in the beginning that James is an exceptional designer, but maker. Like, I remember we had an object where he was having a go at us for using the wrong screws, because you should have thought about which screws you say. He really is, as you've seen, makes beautiful objects really, really well. So feel free to, I'm opening up for questions, any question you have around making, as well as what you're working on right now. Yeah, over to you.
I would have a question.
Yeah, definitely.
Are you approaching these projects more from the point of view of an industrial designer, or more, say, with a kind of phenomenology in mind, or more of a psychoanalytic kind of lens?
It's a good question. You don't need to laugh. I think it depends on the project. there was from my side a big shift, as I said, when I arrived in Madeira. I mean, there's been a big evolution from the early 2000s when we really didn't have a clue what we were doing, to be very honest. It was very experimental. It felt like we were doing something interesting, but why we were doing it and what the implications or the impact of it might be were very vague in the early days. We touched on then the kind of psychological impacts and the really the critique of technology. The more you read like the philosophies of technology from the likes of Langdon Winner or the various French philosophers, you'll see there's a wonderful critique of the role of technology in our lives. Jacques Ellul is another good one. And Jimmy and myself started reading a lot of that work in the early 2000s. And that then started to inform a little bit more of this design approach. So it was acting almost as a philosophy of technology, but through objects rather than through the written word. The problem with that is that whilst the written word is quite easy to disseminate and consume, and people read the books and they cite them, it's a lot less difficult to gauge the impact of a designed object doing the same thing. And then, as I said earlier, the critique started to rise that a lot of these kind of projects were just going to the gallery, and we did a lot of gallery projects. We were in exhibitions a lot. And whilst it's great for the ego, and we were traveling all over the place and drinking lots of wine, at some point you've got to realize, what the fuck am I doing this for? What's being achieved? Am I actually impacting anything at all? And I think there was, of course, an impact, and we were impacting a little bit more, I think, the design community itself rather than anything else. And there was a slow influence, perhaps a little bit, on design education. But as a methodology, it became increasingly important, both for Jimmy, who went off on a slightly different tangent in 2015 when I moved to Madeira. So he's got I'd say his most interesting projects happened after we stopped working together. And probably likewise for myself, where there was much more engagement with real people, and the real people being either in real life contexts, such as the community battery, the community gravity battery in Orkney. We did a project on blockchain where we were working with the European Commission, and it was focused on legislation. So we were working with legislators who will be working to think about how blockchain exists in the world in the near future. And then the other role is working with scientists themselves. So we were doing lots of projects with mathematicians, with people working with AI or with robotics, and we can start to use the design sensibility to talk to those people. I think for me, the more interesting stuff is really the more recent work with the gravity battery, where it's really rethinking the systemic element of design. And that then ideally coming back to impact upon industrial design itself, because it's hugely problematic, the way industrial design is enacted at the moment. You know, if you're looking at the number of products a company like Apple is putting into the world each year, and the value system that's attached to that, so there's a fundamental lack of repairability. It's a closed box that our warranty is void if we go anywhere near it. It's stops working after 18 months because the software and the hardware aren't really compatible. So it's really built for rapid obsolescence. And whilst they might hint towards more ethical approaches to the objects they make, it really is fundamentally a 20th century business model that's informing the industrial design process. So I think for me, it's very much about rethinking what industrial design is today. What could it be? And that then is for the projects, for the students developing projects at my school in Paris, that then is the research question that we start with. If the 20th century version of design is fundamentally broken, what is design? And that can be your research project. So if we think about design, I'm going to borrow again from Charles Eames, who said design is a plan for arranging elements to accomplish a particular purpose. We can start to think about the planning, we can start to think about the elements, what they are and where they come from, who gets to do the arranging. And purpose is always an interesting word because it really gets to the heart of why something exists. And of course, that can be there to be challenged as well.
Thank you. Really, yeah, thinking stuff on all our minds. So really relevant. Thank you. Anybody else want to ask something to James? Thoughts? Reflections?
Maybe I have a question.
Sure.
With these self-made machines and apparati, and there's this romanticism of the unpolished, and you made yourself. And I always feel there's a danger of is this arrogant, towards, we can afford to do things like that because our needs are sort of covered. And is that something you come across in your work, or does that thoughts like that influence decisions, also aesthetic decisions? Where, is this just an exercise of overprivileged people, or how can we actually develop power in a sense, that goes beyond just us?
Yeah, I mean, it's an important question. For me, it starts really with a critique of an understanding of the evolution of industrial design as it is today from, I would argue, the 1930s. United States, so the rise of streamlined modern, the first time Alfred Sloan of General Motors created styling as a reason for someone to buy a car. Before that, it was purely utilitarian. And so we've got this programming of people to desire sexy objects that really grew through the 20th century. And that's what we now expect. It becomes normal to have these highly polished, highly desirable designed objects in our lives. The point being is that end, what does it mean when it's only the end that we value? And fundamentally, what we need to start doing when we evaluate designed objects is also to think about the means as well. So if the means are ethical, if things are being done in a more reasonable, responsible, appropriate way, of course, the end might look slightly different. It might not be quite as desirable. It might not be designed to the same level that we might think it should be. The gravity battery stuff for me is the opposite of what you say. I don't think it's a luxurious thing. If Anab will probably back me up on this very well, is if you look at Jugad coming from India, I've had a PhD student with origins from Pakistan. He grew up in Edinburgh, but Muhammad Ali, I think you might have met him recently, talked a lot in his PhD about Jugadic approaches. And for me, it's very much about dismantling the kind of modernist idea of good design and the influence of the Bauhaus and the influence of the arts and crafts, which is slightly more positive influence, but to think and find influence from outside. And these are, as I said, they're different kinds of relationships with local systems of knowledge, of making, etc., and valuing those first and foremost, not just the aesthetic qualities of the finished object. Of course, we acknowledge this in the book. You'll find a little bit of text there. So the first version is the very ugly gravity battery, which is just solely using things that are found locally. And of course, that constrains its aesthetic qualities. And we make the point that, of course, people aren't quite ready for this just yet, because it means dismantling their ideas of what good design is, which has become very entrenched as it's evolved over so many countless years. And it's for that reason we developed the second tier, the more designed objects, as a way of not challenging so much our aesthetic qualities and ideas of what designed artifacts are, but simply how we make them. So here you have the true combination of the means and the ends coming together. Of course, that limits the potential for it to be industrialized. And I'll be the first to acknowledge that we're not going to totally disrupt the system overnight. This is the only thing that, it's not the only thing, lots of things depress me, but the size of the challenge does depress me, because if you look at the power behind a company like Apple, their ability to really gather materials from the entire planet, to use the most advanced making techniques, the machines that they develop are just beyond compare. None of us will ever have access to such machines, and it gives them this ridiculous advantage, but only when all we're looking at, and the only thing we're evaluating, is the finished object. This is what I think as designers we need to start thinking about more, is the means to the end, and those things somehow acting in conjunction.
I mean,
Thank you.
thanks. Great question, Nico, because I also think that if you think about any kind of colonization, to decolonize takes centuries. Like from India was colonized in the 17th century by the British. It took about 250 years for the decolonization process. So I don't think we are expecting that tomorrow things will change, but I think if more and more people start to think and do this. I just want to give an example. In the studio, we've made this a battery pack, is an example of jugaad from, these are all disposed vaping cartridges that were thrown on the streets in and around London. And they actually still have working batteries in them. So we've just basically assembled all of these vaping cartridges, put them together to power a solar panel, to collect the power of a solar panel to power a website. And in a way, at this point, it's a very simple energy idea, but you know, it's the kind of means, and then I really like that device paradigm, you know, bringing the means and the end closer, which I think many of you are already exploring in your projects. So
for me, that's really an important read. If there's anything I could recommend having a look at, if you've not already, is Borgman's device paradigm, because why I find it so relevant is that I think largely the whole 20th century version of European design has taught designers to focus only on the end. And that means that you can get away with murder, essentially, and literally in many cases, because it's only the artifact that we put on the pedestal. That really, for me, summarizes perfectly 20th century design. And that's the fundamental change that we need to really encourage at the moment. And it's fantastic when we see courses really starting to push this thinking.
It's not easy. It's very tempting to fall into the...
Yeah, well, it's a lot easier. It's easy just to focus on the object. It's a lot easier.
Yeah, and not so much a question, but maybe a way to find a starting point for a discussion on how to develop courses like ours and how to develop them further and how to bring that shift of paradigms in education. Also, it would be really cool to find a way to discuss curriculum also with outside people from, not from education, but from another country, and like James, to how we should further develop our curricula.
I've got an exact perfect response to that. Well, it's not guaranteed yet. Well, I was just chatting to Anab about this earlier. We finished an Erasmus Plus project called Speculative Edu, which was very much about design education. I've just submitted another one with a consortium from Croatia, Estonia, Spain, Netherlands, and France. And that's very much on the design curriculum, how to develop a design curriculum when we're thinking about environmental responsibility and climate change. That we've just put in the proposal, but if that is successful, we'll be launching a 3-year project, which is very much about creating a new design curriculum. And just as Speculative Edu it's all going to be open education, so everything will be on shareable platforms, and we'll be developing design briefs that other institutes can use freely, and it'll be a big open network of discussion exactly about that subject. And from that, there'll be numerous events that will gather educators, designers, and of course, other people from related disciplines. A part of our push from my school in Paris, we're a big research university with chemistry departments, mathematics, engineering. We're looking at energy futures, and we'll be building design briefs around energy futures, but very much in collaboration with experts from scientific disciplines that are related to the subject. So we can keep you informed about that if you're interested. It's of course very much a discursive space because we think it's fundamentally important to really think about our curricula and the maquettes and the type of briefs that we write to really rethink those, to create new versions of design, new ways of designing, new ways of collaborating.
Opportunities as well as what are the opportunities? On that term, what are the opportunities for students when they graduate, as well as part of that?
Yeah, I mean, we're a research master, so it's slightly different. It's quite rare, in fact, to have a master of research. So our students are being equipped in a way that I don't think any other school really equips designers to do a PhD. So my PhD at the RCA, I was totally unprepared for that because I'd come from a normative master of art design. We're teaching philosophy. We have philosophy classes. That's philosophy of technology. We talk a lot about French philosophers like Gilbert Simondon, but we're also doing écriture de research, which is for how to write research papers. There's a little bit of training on that, but it's really, for me, the heart of it is research methods. So how do you inform the process of designing? How much knowledge do you need to have as a designer before you design something? For me, that's a really interesting question that we don't really talk about very much. You know, designers, when you're just designing the surface of things, you don't need a huge amount of knowledge. But if you really want to rigorously question and interrogate the thing itself, then you need to start understanding histories. You need to understand the role of things like infrastructure. Approaches like science and technology studies are incredibly valuable in knowing much more about systemic approaches to design. So the design research approach asks these. I mean, I'd say your course is probably quite closely related to a research course because you're already asking these questions. But it brings more rigor and more of a critical approach to the act of designing. Whereas if I think back to my course at the RCA, apart from Platform 3, which was with Tony Dunn and Doral Bishop, the rest of them were much more really just designing the surface of things, furniture and lamps and things that look pretty, but really don't question much of anything. The research is an interesting word when you get into design, because if you follow the research path, you're not going to have exactly the same trajectory. You can go and work in a research institute or a laboratory, or a lot of companies now have labs where you can have a much more experimental approach. It's an easier pathway into an academic lifestyle. So teaching also is something that we like to do. So teaching and research usually sit side by side.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, are there any other comments or questions from students? Anybody? No? In which case, thank you so much, James. This is really, really relevant and useful and valuable. So thank you, especially because you're under the weather. We'll not keep you any longer. A big round of applause for James. Thank you. And we hope to stay in touch.
We will, yes. Let's try and
stay in touch. Yes. Thank
best.
you all. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Soon. Bye.